Greetings and welcome to the final session of our seminar on democracy and the politics of hate. And what an amazing semester in which to have engaged in this topic of democracy and the politics of division and hate. After a highly divisive presidential election, after a long and unfounded attempt to overturn the results of the election based on claims of election fraud, and after a violent assault in the halls of Congress, our democracy survived this time. But it is evident that serious harm has been done to public trust in our basic electoral institutions, including efforts by then-President Trump and his surrogates to ask state legislatures to annul the votes cast in their states and to send a different set of representatives to the Electoral College. These assaults on the integrity of our electoral system have surely undermined the civic loyalty of large numbers of our fellow citizens. The questions we have spent the last 2 months studying and discussing are all the more important. What are the factors that have worked to undermine support for liberal democracy and the perceived legitimacy of our basic political institutions? And how can we contribute to making a stronger democratic society for the future? We've seen lots of disaffection, both in the course, but also on the news and on social media in the past couple of years. Populism, anti-government ideology, racism, and white supremacy. We've seen dramatic segments of our citizenry on a daily basis who are deeply disaffected with our political and social system. And what is disaffection? It is a turning away from the fundamental value of liberal values, of constitutional system, of the rule of law. For some people, this disaffection leads to disconnection, passivity, or cynical disassociation from political involvement and institutions. But for others, it leads to active efforts to undermine or assault these institutions. Witness the violent and threatening demonstrations which have occurred in various state capitals and the violent assault which took place in the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And it's worth remembering that Just and Jest saw this bifurcation of disaffection in Youngstown and East London between disconnection and active involvement in radical right-wing organizations. We've identified several possible sources or causes of democratic discontent over the past several months in the readings and discussions that we've had. We've seen deliberate efforts by populist politicians to stir up the powerful emotions of xenophobia, racism, mistrust, fear, and hatred. We've seen an economic system that has left some segments of society behind as a result of deindustrialization, globalization, outsourcing, and a race to the bottom with respect to wages and benefits for ordinary working people. And we've seen, most glaringly, substantial, visible inequalities of opportunity in terms of access to education, to higher education, to health care, inequalities in decent living conditions, and being able to live in crime-free neighborhoods. And we can think of Youngstown as Just and Jest describes it. It is clear out of this list of sources of social disaffection that social mobility and opportunity play an important role in much of this disaffection. And that's understandable. All of us want to live in a society in which we are treated fairly and having fair opportunities and equal opportunities based only on our willingness to take on assignments, our willingness to work hard. We want those opportunities. Logically, then, we might suspect that improving opportunity and mobility would decrease disaffection and increase positive engagement. And this suggests the need for economic reform. And significantly, President Biden is undertaking major steps in terms of economic reform for ordinary people. So let's think a little more closely about some possible remedies for the medium term and the long term to this problem of political disaffection. First, genuine policy efforts by parties to enact reforms addressing the issues and concerns of working people. This seems like just an absolutely urgent priority. Second, we might consider changes in income tax law that would require everyone to pay their fair share, including corporations and the very rich. It is shocking and offensive to see the dramatic inequalities between the $100 million take-home compensation for some people in our economy and those living on the minimum wage, working hard and living on a poverty wage in other parts of our economy. Third, we can imagine reforms which involve enhancement in the social safety net that ensure that working people are not ruined by economic hardship, as well as the current crisis created by the coronavirus. And it is very interesting that European countries have taken a very different approach than the United States has taken in terms of economic security during the coronavirus. And fourth, a factor that we've discussed a couple times, the idea of cultivating community organizations and perhaps faith-based organizations that facilitate cross-group understanding and collaboration. We've seen the power of the idea of knitting together a civic community of people whose lives and experiences are quite different, but who can come to understand each other and come to have regard for each other and respect for each other through community organizations. We need to address racial and ethnic hostilities. It is perfectly evident in many countries that societies go through ups and downs in terms of the intensity and prevalence of racial and ethnic antagonism. We can see that in many countries over the past 100 years. It is evident as well that when racial antagonisms are high in a country, this gives an opening to radical populist and white supremacist appeals to a broader basis of support. And this suggests the importance of addressing the causes of intergroup fear, suspicion, and antagonism. Our society, US society, is clearly a multiracial, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic society. So it is crucial for us to have ongoing processes for improving intergroup relations. White supremacy and the supremacy of one group over another cannot be a basis of harmonious democratic civil life. Organizations can play a lead role, and this photograph of people involved in the Take On Hate organization founded by People in Access, and you see Representative Tlaib right in the center of this photograph before she was elected to Congress. This is a great example of an organization which has done some very good work on knitting a community together and finding a basis for overcoming the hostility and antagonism which sometimes exists between religious communities or racial or ethnic communities. Another important factor is the nature of leadership. Populism, as we've seen, depends on charismatic leaders, individuals who have a knack, sometimes an ugly and a really harmful and frightening knack, for evoking the angry and resentful emotions of their potential followers. Political parties also have a structural tendency towards playing to the extremes of their potential supporters, and as we know from American politics, the primary system in elective office supports that tendency to play towards the extremes. It is fairly clear that our democracy would be strengthened by a much larger cohort of rising leaders in both major parties who build their political programs around broadly shared values, not the fractional values of the extreme minorities whose votes they're looking for. Values like the rule of law, belief in the equality of all citizens, belief in the importance of personal integrity in office and in one's political behavior. We might summarize that by thinking back in American political history and noticing that we need to have more people like John McCain, Adlai Stevenson, George Romney, Sherrod Brown of Ohio, and Barack Obama. These were political leaders who spoke their minds, had the courage of their convictions, and lived their political lives consistently with the principles which they advocated. We need to have leaders who consistently speak up for the value and importance of our democratic values and institutions, whatever the short-term political advantage that might come to them by supporting different and more divisive messages. And what about us as citizens? How can ordinary citizens within a democracy help to make our democracy more secure? How can we contribute to the resilience and stability of our democracy? A couple of things seem kind of evident. One is to be engaged, to vote, to evaluate candidates and parties, to consider becoming a candidate yourself. Second, to make sure that you are involved in the political issues of the time, to make your voice known in support of democratic values. Values like the rule of law, respect for constitutional protections, solidarity with other groups, anti-racism, and so forth. And third, citizens can contribute time and resources to support the political process and the candidates that they can believe in. Citizens can have a lot of impact on the political behavior of the candidates who run for office and who secure office. There are real opportunities for genuine, impactful, grassroots involvement in political organizations that can lead to meaningful influence on the national agenda for legislation and policy. In the history of the past century or century and a half, it's kind of clear that social political change can only occur through a relatively small number of mechanisms. First, democratic change can be enacted through the involvement of citizens and their representatives in pursuing a more satisfactory social, political, economic world for all citizens. That's one possibility. A second possibility is gradual decay of institutions. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Just not paying attention and allowing the checks and balances, the institutional protections built into our electoral and judicial and legislative and executive branches of government to allow those checks and balances to decay and become less effective. And then third, grimly, there's the possibility of rapid, substantial change enacted by an authoritarian leader. And we have, regrettably, many examples, both in the 20th century and in the 21st century, of this kind of seizure of power by authoritarian and sometimes populist leaders. If we don't want an authoritarian government from either the right or the left, either Mussolini or Castro, then we must put our energy into making the democratic option work. I've quoted several times the quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin, "What kind of government have you given us?" And Franklin replied, "A democracy if you can keep it." And this is, in fact, a fine ending for our course. The life of a democracy and a democratic people is a challenging one. It is one which requires constant effort and attention. It requires our concentration and our loyalty, but it is worth it. Here's a closing image of people in Hong Kong demonstrating in favor of democracy in the city of Hong Kong. Thank you, and I look forward to some conversation about these final ideas.